it's hard to document Métis urbanization. Okay, we don't have a good sense of when most Métis people became urban. Okay, what are the current patterns in comparison to previous patterns? There's some indication that Métis have been more urban than First Nations people for quite a while. There was the 1956 survey in Manitoba that suggested that even at the mid-century, okay, about a third of the Métis population was urban. Okay. But the other thing that's interesting is that over the last decade, the Métis population has only increased in the proportion who live in cities from 60 to 68%. And in the last 5 years, that increase has only been 1 or 2%. Okay? So on the one hand, Métis are more urban than First Nations people. On the other hand, they're not urbanizing at a huge rate in the last decade. And again, I think that raises some questions about attachment to rural areas among the Métis population that I can't answer from the census. The percentage of the increase of the Métis population in urban areas is substantially higher than the percent of the increase in North American Indians. In cities, as in provinces, the Métis population now represents a very substantial proportion. Okay, so for example, in Winnipeg, 56% of the Aboriginal population is Métis. And that's an increase of almost 14% over the last decade. So there's some interesting implications here for the politics of representation for urban Aboriginal people associated with that kind of an increase. If we look at socioeconomic characteristics in cities, and here the picture I present is slightly different than Andy's. If we look at a variety of socioeconomic characteristics, Métis generally do better, and this is not urban particularly, this is in Canada. Métis generally do better than North American Indians, but they fall quite far behind all non-Aboriginal people. And this kind of pattern you find in every single city. Okay? At the same time, there's some enormous variations. Okay, so for example, an average income of almost $16,000 in Winnipeg compared to an average income of about $24,000 in Toronto. And if you look at the statistics across all of these socioeconomic characteristics, there's not any clear picture that emerges. In general, the prairie cities, Métis seem to be worse off, okay, but then you get things like really high participation in university education in some of these prairie statistics. So again, I think it points to variation by city, but it also points to some heterogeneity within particular cities. Okay, so you get some Métis populations that are not very well off. You get some Métis populations that are quite well off. Okay, so that you get a growing percentage earning $40,000 or more, okay, and possibly being part of the middle class. So it's hard to generalize across cities, and it's even hard to generalize within cities because Métis represent a fairly heterogeneous population. Let me just look at one final element, and that is distribution within cities. And I won't go into the dissimilarity index, because it's complicated, but even more, it's a lousy indicator, but it's used a lot. Except to say that in general, the dissimilarity index shows that Métis people are slightly less concentrated in most cities than North American Indians. But overall, there's not evidence of that kind of ghettoization that you see in the popular media, either for North American Indians or for Métis people. Okay? When you get indexes like, 0.45, 0.58, and most of these are in that range. Okay. That's a relatively moderate level of segregation. Okay. Let's look at it in a way that I think is a lot more straightforward. These are dissemination areas, which are relatively small areas in the city. And this looks at the number of areas with these proportions of Métis people. Okay, so 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, and 30 and over. So the proportion of this small area that's Métis. Most cities and most Métis people, okay, let's start over again. Most Métis people live in areas where they make up 0 to 10% of the population. Okay, if you look at these number of dissemination areas, that's most of the dissemination areas in the city. Okay. The only cities where you get dissemination areas where Métis make up 30% or more are Winnipeg and Edmonton. Okay. And let me just pull out those maps quickly to show you where those areas are. Okay, and that probably doesn't help you, but if I point, it might. One of the 30% areas in Winnipeg is this area. And maybe somebody knows what that is. This is the river. Okay. It's near Marquette, but where is this? Portage? No, Portage-la-Prairie is over here. Okay. Where is it? Okay. 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 That area has 30 to 40% Métis. Okay, but most of the rest of the rural fringe here is 0 to 10%, or sorry, 1 to 10%. If we look at the other, in Winnipeg, the census tracts where the Métis make up 30 to 40% are this one, and this one. And I'm sorry that didn't come up. That's that part I know. It's the north end, yeah. Because you have the river here, eh? Point Douglas right here. Okay, and then you have an. Would you like to come up here and finish? Okay. And then you also have a number of areas where Métis make up 20 to 30%, right around here. Okay, but they don't make up the majority. I mean, 30 to 40% is quite high, but they're not the majority of the population. But they are in an area with a number of other areas that have high Métis populations. In Edmonton, there are 2 areas where Métis make up 30 to 40%, and the core of Edmonton is here. It's this area and this tiny little area here. So there aren't any areas in the inner city where Métis make up even between 30 and 40%. This is the rural fringe. Okay. But, okay, this is a real... Yeah, that's the 10-second one. Okay, so there are some areas of relative concentration within cities, but there aren't any areas yet where Métis make up over half of the population. Okay, and this is the conclusion, and it didn't come out in the binder, so I have some copies if somebody's interested in it. The population statistics, they say, are just that. It depends on what people do with them. Okay. But clearly the change in the Métis population over time means that there may be shifts in the relative balance of power, and there may be some implications for the politics of representation. Okay. The second thing that I found really frustrating is the relative lack of data on Métis people before the last decade. And there's some wonderful historical research about original Métis communities, but what happened to Métis communities in the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s? And that I found really, really frustrating, because I want to get a sense of what the trends are. We have a good sense of where Métis people are now, but where were they 30 years ago? And I would hope that that starts to change. There's some places where Métis people are a relatively significant part of the population, but most Métis people live in areas where they are a minority. So most Métis people in the contemporary situation formulate their identities in areas where they're a minority population. And I wonder what implications that has for the emergence of Métis identities. Do Métis identities that are created where Métis are a minority look different than Métis identities that emerge from homogeneous, stable, long-standing communities? Okay. And finally, there's a lot of heterogeneity. There's class heterogeneity. There's heterogeneity in terms of socioeconomic status. There's heterogeneity in terms of residence, rural and urban. There's clearly a lot of heterogeneity in terms of Métis histories. And it creates a major challenge to political organizations representing Métis people to meet the aspirations of a variety of people. And it creates a major challenge for politics and legal scholars to address this kind of heterogeneity. Thank you.